Good evening, my holy sisters and brothers. It's a Thursday afternoon. It is still the 16th of the Hebrew month of Sivan. That's my Hebrew birthday. So this is a day on which I can give blessings. We have a tradition that a person on their birthday, this was, they have a great mazel. They have the stars, the way it was aligned when they were born. It sort of has some kind of a channel that remains in the world. And so every year when it comes around, your Hebrew birthday, you have this ability to channel blessings a little bit more than normal from heaven to the people around you. So if there's something, a blessing that you could use, put it in the comments. I would love to give you a blessing so that all your worthy desires should be fulfilled. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we get it going on a Thursday evening, my Hebrew birthday? James in Indianapolis, Paula is here, John in Maine, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Paula in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, Melissa in New York, Sandra in Ohio, Bill in Berkeley, Erin in Missouri, Nancy in North Carolina, Carolyn in Raleigh, Marjorie in Georgia, Jill in Willamette, Ryan wishing us a good evening from Jacksonville. Thank you, Paula, for your birthday wishes. Rebecca in LA. And Bill says, prayers for my job search are appreciated as always. Bill, may you be blessed to find exactly the position that you need and that the world needs you in. And we say amen. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Gwen is so happy to be here on time. Seraphim in Sacramento. And Gwen is wishing me a happy birthday. Thank you so much. And Lynn, my Western birthday is today. Let's share. Great. Happy birthday to you, Lynn. All the best. Okay, I always like to share just a little bit of Torah at the beginning of our class. And today I was struck during morning davening, during morning prayers. It's something that I think I mentioned before that I took on at the beginning of COVID when we were all, shut in, praying from home, praying without our minyanim, not with groups, praying alone. That I started to take on to read. It's in every Jewish prayer book, the Akedas Yitzhak every day, the binding of Isaac, that, mysterious, almost incomprehensible moment when God tested Abraham and said to him, bring your son Isaac as an offering, an elevation offering, which we've been talking about in Ola, on a mountain where I will show you. And it's not a long passage, and I'm sure I've mentioned before that I still read it every day. And every day in this short passage, how many verses is it? Not that many. It's chapter 22, Genesis 22, verses 1 through, is it 27? No, not even. Verses 1 through 19, right? Genesis 22, 1 through 19, just 19 verses. And every day that I read it, I discover something new in it. And what I noticed today is in verse 2, right? So verse 1 is, and it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, and he said, Hineni, here I am. Verse 2, and he said, God said, please take your son. Kach na. Take, please. Now, Abraham is only bringing his son as an offering because God has commanded him to do that. He wouldn't do it for any other reason. Like all parents, Abraham adored his son. Not only that, God had promised Abraham that, that his descendants would become a great nation, and that would happen through the line of Yitzhak. And now, for some reason, God says, bring your son up as an offering. And of course, this is before Isaac has met Rebekah. This is before Isaac has married. So there is no offspring of Isaac. There's no Jacob yet. So in this mysterious test, God commands Abraham. What I notice today is he's commanding him to do it, but he says, please. God says, please to Abraham, almost indicating that Abraham has a choice. Why? Why does he say please? Why is that word included, that little Hebrew word, na, please? So Rashi says about this, kach na, take please, is only an expression of a request. God said to him, I beg of you, pass this test for me. Not, I beg of you to do this, like you have a choice. I'm commanding you to do it. But I beg you that you will pass this test so that people, or so that they, will not say that the first ones, the first tests, had no substance. Now, Rashi here refers us to a passage in Tractate Sanhedrin of the Talmud, page 89b, and it says here, Rabbi Shimon bar Abba says, the word na is nothing other than an expression of entreaty, like begging. God is begging Abraham not to do it. God is commanding Abraham to do it. He's begging him to pass the test. Why did God request rather than command that Abraham take his son? And the Gemara cites a parable of a flesh and blood king who has confronted many wars. And he had one warrior fighting for him, and he overcame his enemies. Over time, eventually some time passed, and there was a fierce war, the greatest war that this king had ever faced. And so the king said to his warrior, because the king is not the warrior, in this case the king, he's an older king, let's say, and his main warrior is the one who goes out and does battle for him, his general, his main general. And the king says to his great warrior, I entreat you, right? Nah, please, I beg you, stand firm for me in this war, so that others will not say there is no substance in the first victories, and that you are not a true warrior. And likewise, the Holy One, blessed be he, also said to Abraham, I have tried you, I have tested you with several ordeals, and you have withstood them all. Now stand firm in this ordeal for me, so that others will not say there is no substance in the first ordeals. This immediately asks a lot of questions. Well, first of all, what are these ordeals, right? Our tradition says that there were 10 tests that Abraham faced, and the binding of Isaac, right, the seeming test that he would bring his son as an offering, was the 10th and final of the 10 tests. Now, different commentators over time have listed the 10 tests in different ways. Maimonides lists them as follows. He takes them all from the Torah. The first test, God says to Abraham, leave your homeland and be a stranger in the land of Canaan. Immediately upon his arrival in the promised land, he encounters a famine. That's the second test. 3, the Egyptians seize his beloved wife Sarah and bring her to Pharaoh. 4, Abraham faces incredible odds in the battle of the 4 and 5 kings. 5, the incident of Hagar after not being able to have children with Sarah. 6, God tells him to circumcise himself at an advanced age, the first person to do that. 7, the king of Gerar captures Sarah, intending to take her for himself. Number 8, God tells him to send Hagar away after having a child with her, Ishmael. 9, his son Ishmael becomes estranged from him. I mean, Abraham was embodied loving kindness. It was terrible for him to have to send his son Ishmael away. And number 10, God tells him to sacrifice his dear son Isaac upon the altar. Other lists of these 10 tests vary a little bit, and we'll take some incidents from the Midrash that are not explicitly stated in the Torah, like when Abraham was thrown into a fiery furnace. That's not an incident in the Torah, but it appears in the rabbinic writings in the Midrash. At any rate, Abraham passed all these tests, and now God is saying, I beg you, pass this 10th and final test and prove once and for all that you're worthy to become the father of this holy nation. Prove to who? Who is God trying to impress that his chosen one, Abraham, was a good choice? Right? Is it the other humans? The angels in heaven? God's self? God proving it to God's self? It's odd. It seems like this is a test that God wants Abraham to pass, in a sense, so that God will pass some kind of a test for making this choice with Abraham. It's a very mysterious passage. It's difficult to understand. But I'll say that the way I read it, the way I interpret it, the way I take it now, and today, after reading this, God's saying to Abraham, please, please take your son and now please pass this test. It's almost like, if you have a favorite movie that you've seen many times, and so most likely if you have a favorite movie, you really care about the main character in the movie. You know what's going to happen to the main character. You're still going to be gripped, emotionally gripped, as he passes through those events. You want him to succeed. Yes, there's a part of you that knows he'll succeed, but you're with him or her. You're with that main character as they're going through their greatest ordeals. And I think God is like that. God knows what the outcome is going to be. Future and past are all the same to God. But God is with Abraham in this ordeal and wants him to succeed. And I think God is with us in all of our toughest moments and wants us to stick to our principles, to stick to our values, and to come through those ordeals more evolved, more holy, more spiritual, more experienced. God is with us in those most painful moments and rooting for us. And I think that's something that we can hold on to in our toughest moments. All right, let's get into today's daf. It is page 46 here in Tractate Yoma, the laws of Yom Kippur. This is daf mem, daf mem vav. Yesterday was mem hey. So we're on page 46, and we're going to be completing, with God's help, chapter 4. The first, it's actually going to, the reason I took a little longer with our little Torah section is because what we're going to be learning together of this daf is relatively short. It's a short page to begin with. The A side continues what we've been talking about yesterday, that on the altar, the outer altar in the courtyard of the Holy Temple, which I explained yesterday, is a large altar. I mean, it's a big space, like, a good part of the size of this room, and there was room up on that altar for like a large bonfire where they would bring the daily offerings to be burned, and all the private offerings, individual offerings of the people that were brought on any particular day. Some were elevation offerings, meaning that all of the limbs of the animal would go up on that bonfire. Some were peace offerings, where just a little bit would go up in the fire, and then the people would eat that. Sin offerings, most of it would go up in the fire. Some of it would be eaten by the priests, etc. But there were other fires up there as well, and the sages disagreed how many fires were up there on a normal day. But at least according to some opinions, there's the main bonfire up on the altar. There's another fire that is used to replenish the main fire if it should die down. There's yet another fire that is used to take coals out of it, to take into the sanctuary on a normal day, just the sanctuary where the incense altar was, and they would bring special coals for that incense offering on every day of the year, morning and afternoon. And on Yom Kippur, an additional fire. And they would take coals from that, and the high priest would take it through the sanctuary and into the Holy of Holies, where he only entered on Yom Kippur. There's yet another fire that might be up on that altar, and that is for, they had all these limbs of offerings that had to be burned up on that day. Well, if it was a holiday, if it was a festival, for example, or just a lot of people brought offerings, there might not be time for all of those animal parts from the animal sacrifices to go up in smoke on the main fire. And so there would be an additional fire that they could just these kind of leftover offerings from the day before. And really, they try to get through them all that night. They should all be consumed, if not during the day, then the night that follows. But sometimes even the night was not long enough. And so some of them would be burning on the next day in that special fire. So with regard to this, the limbs, right? These extra limbs of the offerings that need to be consumed on the altar, on the A side of our page 46, the question was asked, does the burning of those extra limbs override certain restrictions that would normally say you can't burn them on the altar? Namely, what if there's ritual impurity? And here we're talking about not the individual offerings, but the daily offerings, meaning the communal offerings, the national offerings, that every day there's a morning offering and an afternoon offering. Once the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago, the morning offering and the afternoon, these daily offerings were replaced by the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer. At any rate, they had to be brought every day. And so what if you could only bring that offering in a state of impurity? There was no replacement offering, and the offering, that animal was going to be brought in a state of tuma, ritual impurity, or there's no other priest to bring it except one who is impure. Do we still bring the daily offering? Answer, yes, we do. But for these kind of extra offerings that didn't get consumed on their own day, what if it becomes Shabbos? Do we still bring them when it's Shabbos? And the law on that was that the burning of the limbs of the daily offering overrides a prohibition to sacrifice it in a state of impurity, if there's no other choice, but it does not override the prohibitions of Shabbos. Therefore, the limbs of the Friday offering must be burned on that day, as the beginning stages of the daily offering override Shabbos, but not the end. We have a daily offering that is brought on Shabbos, but we won't bring on the altar the parts of the Friday offering that didn't get consumed on Friday as they should. That was the A side of our page. We pick it up on the B side, and with this little section, we're going to end chapter 4. And the Torah prohibits the fire on the altar to be extinguished. Sometimes this is referred to as sometimes it's called the Ner Tamid, and sometimes it's called the Aish Tamid. This is at Leviticus 6:6. So let me just make sure I have the language correctly. Leviticus chapter 6. Go. It's an Aish Tamid, right? So Leviticus 6:6. An Aish Tamid, an eternal flame, right? So there shall be an eternal flame on the altar. You shall not let, a perpetual fire is how it's translated here in the Kohen Talmud. A perpetual fire shall be kept burning on the altar. It shall not go out. Now, this is reflected in modern times. If you go to any synagogue, you'll see in the sanctuary that there's the Aron Kodesh, right? So there's the ark where the Torahs are stored in the synagogue. And generally above it and in front of it, there is this Ner Tamid or this Aish Tamid, this eternal flame. It's really symbolic because it's usually an electric bulb. And hopefully the synagogue has some kind of backup electrical system so that it should never go out. But it's really not by a command. It's just we're remembering the temple, and it's one of our greatest sadnesses that the temple is no longer with us, and we've been lamenting, we've been mourning for the loss of the temple for 2,000 years. However, when the temple was standing, when the tabernacle was standing, and then when the temple was standing, and so we had the altar in our midst, and the Kohanim, the priests, were officiating there, so that flame on the altar had to be kept burning all the time, 24/7. So with regard to this prohibition that you should not let that flame go out, there was a dispute among the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Talmud, and they stated, with regard to one who extinguishes the fire of the coals that are taken with the coal pan for the incense on Yom Kippur, or the fire of the coals that are taken in order to light the candelabrum, the menorah that stands in the sanctuary. Abaye said he is liable, and Rava said he is not liable. In other words, a priest went up on the altar and he took some hot coals from the fire that's up on the altar. For what purpose? Either it's the high priest on Yom Kippur and he's taking some of those coals and he's going to take it into the Holy of Holies, and he's going to put the super finely ground incense on it, with the incense with which he enters the Holy of Holies. Or on a regular day, an ordinary priest took some coals, this is done every morning, would take some coals from the altar, walk into the sanctuary, and use that fire to light the menorah, the 7-branched menorah that stood in the sanctuary. So while he's carrying that coal, if he puts it out or he lets it go out, it's a little unclear here, whether this is an intentional transgression or an unintentional transgression, and the way it's worded here, with one who extinguishes the fire, okay? So he extinguishes it, not just let it burn out, but somehow it becomes extinguished. He drops it into a bucket of water, either by mistake or on purpose, but it extinguishes. That fire is extinguished. So has he violated this negative mitzvah that you must not let the fire go out? Has he violated that commandment, which is in the Torah, Leviticus 6:6? Abaye says, yes, he is liable for violating this commandment. And Rava said, no, he is not liable. The Gemara elaborates on the dispute. In a case where one extinguished a coal while still standing on top of the altar, everyone agrees that he is liable. He took a coal from out of that fire and he put it out. While he's standing on the altar, he extinguished a flame of the altar. And this is because the verse explicitly is referring to extinguishing a flame, quote, upon the altar. Where do they disagree? It's in the case where he brought the coals down to the ground level. He took it off the altar, walked down the ramp. Now he's on the ground level of the temple courtyard, and he extinguished the coal there. Abaye said he is liable, since it is still considered a fire of the altar. And Rava said he is not liable, because once it has been removed from the altar, it is no longer a fire of the altar. So if he extinguishes it now when it's off the altar, okay, so he didn't violate the law. Do not extinguish the fire of the altar. And the Gemara asks, but if so, with regard to this ruling that Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba bar Avu, one who takes down a coal from the altar and extinguishes it is liable. So in accordance with whose opinion is he ruling? Could he possibly be ruling in accordance with the opinion of Abaye? Because that's what Abaye said. But it can't be, because in disputes between Abaye and Rava, we always follow the ruling of Rava, right? Rava was an older sage. Abaye was Rava's student. And the Gemara explains, you can even say his ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rava by making the following distinction. There, in the ruling of Rav Nachman, the coal was not removed to fulfill its own commandment, meaning to go into the Holy of Holies with the incense or to go into the sanctuary to light the menorah. Rather, you just took it off the altar. So if you just took it off the altar and put it out, and then you put it out, you violated the Torah commandment because it's still considered a fire of the altar. But if you remove that coal from the altar in order to go do a different mitzvah, so now you've removed this coal from being the fire of the altar, and now it's something else. Now it's the spark that you're going to take to go perform another mitzvah. And there are those who say a different version of the dispute. In a case where he brought the coals down to the ground and extinguished a coal there, everyone agrees that he is not liable. Where do they disagree? It's in a case where one extinguished a coal while he's still standing on top of the altar. And Abaye said he is liable since it is still considered a fire of the altar, even though he took it out of the actual fire pile on top of the altar. And Rava said he is not liable because once it has been removed from the altar fire, even if he's still standing up there on the altar, but he took the coal out of the pyre, the Pyre that's on that altar, he has removed it and it is no longer part of the altar's fire. Therefore, the prohibition does not apply to it. If so, the Gemara asks, but with regard to this ruling of Rav Nachman that he said in the name of Rabba bar Avu, he who takes down a coal from upon the altar and extinguishes it is liable. So in accordance with whose opinion is he ruling? It would appear that it is neither in accordance with Abaye nor with Rava. And the Gemara explains, you can even say that his ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rava by making the following distinction. There, in the ruling of Rav Nachman, the coal was not removed to fulfill its mitzvah. You just took it out of the altar fire, and then you extinguished it. So you can't do that. You violated the prohibition. But if you took it out of the altar fire, even while you're still standing on the altar, but you've removed it for the purpose of going to do another mitzvah, so now this coal in your vessel in your hand is no longer part of the altar fire. It has become something else. And indeed, the halacha, the law is, and with this I finish today and finish chapter 4, and I'm coming to your comments and questions. One who extinguishes the fire of the altar transgresses a negative commandment and receives lashes for doing so. He is similarly punished for extinguishing even a single coal or for removing a coal from the altar and then extinguishing it. But one does not receive lashes for extinguishing the fire for the incense coal pan or for the menorah, even if he does so while he's still standing on top of the altar. And this is because these fires are removed from their original designated purpose for other mitzvahs. And so we see that when is a fire not a fire, right? When is an altar fire not an altar fire? It could be when you remove it from the altar and step down. But no, because if it's still part of the altar fire, even though you took it off the altar, it's still part of the altar fire. You can't put it out. But if you took it off the altar fire in order to go perform a different mitzvah, now you've transformed that fire into a different item. This is a fire not of the altar, but a fire that's going to be used to kindle the menorah or to have the superfine incense spread on it so that it'll go up in a beautiful, pleasing aroma, smoke for God inside the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and it has changed its character. In all these cases, the coal looks the same, but its purpose defines its essence, right? And that's a good lesson that, we think we see something for what it is, but we don't know necessarily from the outside, just at a glance, what's really going on there, where this person, for example, we pass someone on the street, we see them dressed in a certain way or performing a certain activity, and we might be quick to judge them. Yeah, but we don't know what's really going on with them. They might be engaged in very holy work. So for example, when in the minyan where I daven every day, morning and evening, so there's a couple of guys who come and they're always collecting money, and they have like a big stack of dollar bills and other bills. And, one who's not familiar with this practice and who they are might think, wow, these guys are really good at, begging. Like, how much money do they really need? They got a stack of bills in their hand. I don't really feel the need to add to his stack of bills. He doesn't seem so poor to me. But maybe it's not that he's schnoring for himself. Maybe he's a collector for a charity, or maybe he's a sort of more direct collector. He's collecting for a few individuals, right, who really need funds. Maybe they're homebound, they're not able to go and collect for themselves, and these are the guys who take it on themselves to sort of play the part of the beggar, but not for themselves, right? They are engaged in very holy work, collecting funds for the community, for the needy, right? And you don't know what's going on with these guys if you just take it in at a glance and, become quick to pass judgment. All right, let's go to your comments and questions. Baruch Hashem. Okay, Nina says there were a lot of comments on my Torah from the beginning of class about when God said to Abraham, not just take your son and bring him up to Mount Moriah as an offering, but rather, please take your son. Something I noticed this morning. It really stood out to me. Bill, I'm reminded of a scene from classic TV, Doctor Who, the first Doctor, played by William Hartnell. I've heard of the show. I apologize, I'm not familiar with it. Played by William Hartnell, is leaving his granddaughter behind as their journeys part. And he says to her, among other things, go forward in your beliefs and prove to me that I am not mistaken in mine. So perhaps God wanted Abraham to prove that God was indeed right in choosing Abraham. Exactly. So that was the point, that we're on the same page. Brinna, it's amazing how your Divrei Torah, how your words of Torah are relevant to my ordinary day. I'm so glad. Turn it over and over, for everything is in it. Right? Every time we're sitting there about to waste time, social media, whatever, it's so much better to just pick up a Bible, pick up a prayer book, pick up a Talmud, pick up something, because you never know what you're going to find in it that day, but undoubtedly it'll add something to your day. And then when you share it with others, you never know. It might be that the reason you picked up that book and shared that thought that struck you was just so that somebody else could hear it, and you wouldn't want to get in the way of bringing that blessing to other people. So thank you, Brenda, for letting me know that. Sharon, it increases the meaning of Torah events if we place ourselves in the story and attempt not to read it with our advanced knowledge of the outcomes. True for Abraham and also for the story of Joseph. Amen. Absolutely. Good observation. Tom, as the Eitz Chaim Torah commentary says, we read the entire Torah every year. It doesn't change, but we do. Exactly right. And that's why we'll always keep finding, new words of wisdom, new insights into ourselves, into our families, into our communities, into the Holy One. We'll always find something new. Tim, I saw this as the final leg of the journey out of the Chaldeans, which was the practice of human sacrifice. God with us takes Abraham to the fullness of the righteousness God saw within him, which now Abraham can experience. Right, it's almost like, I like that, Tim. It's almost like, remember, Abraham is living in a world that is absolutely steeped in child sacrifice, particularly in this area of the world. And eventually, the reason that God will sort of give the Holy Land to the Jewish people and say that the people who had been living there, what they were doing was an abomination, is because of the child sacrifice that they all practiced. They had so misunderstood God's world and what true spirituality is in God's world, that they were sacrificing their children to made-up deities, and God had enough of it. Right? But that's the world that Abraham grew up in. And not only that, and we know from the Midrash that Abraham's father was an idol maker. Right? I mean, he grew up like in a house of idolatry. His father making idols for other people to worship. And he had to, finally confront that aspect of himself before he could fully move on. And sometimes these tests that come upon us, we can't imagine that we need to be tested. Like, well, we overcame that a long time ago. That is not an issue for me. Until it is, right? That used to be an issue for me, not anymore. That was never an issue for me. And then you're tested. And then you find out, is it really not an issue for you? And finally, Abraham realized perhaps for himself, where he had been and where his family was and where that world was and what it was going to take to wean the world away from those kinds of practices. Now, with respect to the altar fire, Tom says, my synagogue, when we built our new sanctuary, installed a gas flame for the Ner Tamid. So beautiful. So this idea that the Ner Tamid, this eternal candle that is in synagogues and represents the Aish Tamid, the perpetual fire that was kept burning on the altar. Usually it's an electric bulb, but here in Tom's synagogue, they want it to be more like a flame, so they have a gas jet, a gas flame that's doing that. That's nice. I haven't seen that. That must be very beautiful. Sharon, What mitzvah would one be doing with the coal? And you probably asked that before I went on to talk about that. You remove the coal to light the menorah in the sanctuary, or on Yom Kippur to take those coals into the Holy of Holies. You'd also be taking it to light the incense altar on a regular day, the inner incense altar. It's sort of the outer incense, the incense altar that's in the sanctuary. The priests would do that every day. On Yom Kippur, they would take coal. The high priest would take a coal into the Holy of Holies. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, and we'll open chapter 5 on page 47. And we're going to continue as in this tractate. Yoma works its way through the day of Yom Kippur, and we started with the priest secluding himself in the temple courtyard for 7 days before Yom Kippur. And now we've got it here in chapter 4. We started the day, and he was doing the rituals associated with his bull and with the 2 goats and with the incense that he's going to take into the Holy of Holies and the coals, etc. But it's sort of like he's running three or four of these ceremonies at the same time, doing a part of each and then going on to the next, in this whole beautiful and complex choreography of the Yom Kippur day. And we're going to continue moving the high priest through his avodah, through his divine service on Yom Kippur when we get back together with God's help tomorrow. Have a great night.